Hello, everybody. My name is Boulevard. This is Tournament Tactician, perhaps one of the most important ones of the year as it pertains to the Last Chance Qualifier. Unfortunately, it's also one of the most scuffed ones because, as many of you are aware, last weekend we had the Runeterra Eternal Open, and then we had to turn around, do Standard, get ready for the LCQ. And unfortunately, I really haven't been home much since the Runeterra Open ended, so most of what I'm going to be dealing with here exists in the theoretical. I got to play Standard Ladder a little bit last week before the Eternal Open. Obviously, now that everyone has jumped back into Standard, we've had a few developments, but don't feel too worried about that. Boulevard mostly thrives in the theoretical. It's just this time around, it's going to be like 90% instead of my usual 80%. And I played a lot of Runeterra going into the World Championship qualifier this time around, and I felt very confident in doing that. And it's very unfortunate that I just didn't have time to do it this time around. But, real life gets in the way sometimes. It wasn't even like Thanksgiving related. It was a bunch of other stuff. But let's talk about the meta. So let's take a look first at the patch, because effectively we are in a rather unique scenario where this is the same meta as the Fates Voyage Worlds qualifier. The exception is that a couple of new cards got introduced and there was a balance patch. Now, luckily, pretty much none of the new cards do anything in Standard. Bourdir, combined with a buff onto Tryndamere and Warmother's Call, has revived the Warmother's archetype. That is relevant, but it's not like it's a Bourdir deck, right? Nobody's like turboing out Bourdir and other Titanic units. None of these other ones have really made an impact. I'm gonna eat my words when we see one of these in the top 5, like Chemtech Drake bullshit, I don't even know. And Enraged Firespitter, while it really rose the prominence of Draven Rumble and Draven Vi in Eternal, it really hasn't done much in Standard. The only deck I've seen it really pop up in is actually Noxus Bandle Gunners, which we'll talk about a little bit later, because Bandle Gunners, always kind of on the cusp. They're hanging around, but for the most part, I'm not really expecting a big rise out of them. They're just something I want you to be aware of as like the one Enraged Firespitter deck. Jhin Broadmane, even like when win a tournament and did not play Enraged Firespitter. So looking at tournaments from the last, I know it says 5 days, this is actually 3 days, this is like Monday onward. We have Runeterra Royale and Wolf Oxy for the most part, and then a Runeterra Clash that happened on Monday. I took all of these from Santupi's Twitter, as I always do. And when we go through here, you'll see like Jaxorn, Nora Harmer, Karmaset, Jaxorn, Frostbite midrange. Now, Frostbite midrange, again, when we look back at the World's Qualifier meta, obviously important things have happened here, right? Nyla Janna got taken down enough of a peg that it's basically a non-factor in a lot of people's minds, and Scouts lost champion strength. These two decks getting knocked off does warp the meta, just not in like as big of a way as you might expect. What people are really looking at is still like the old mid-range stuff that we were looking at, right? Like Frostbite midrange, Shen Jarvan, Jaxorn, stuff like that. The problem that I think we're going to run into this time around is a similar one that we ran into last time, where as we actually get into top cut, like Shen Jarvan really falls off, Frostbite midrange really falls off. They just don't kind of keep up very well against a wider meta that you expect in the Swiss rounds, and even some of the control variants that we'll get into in a second here. But just taking a look at what's been doing well, you might notice that like Karmaset, Formidable, and Jhin Broadmane actually won 2 Wolf Oxy events. The reason that I have the asterisk here is because it was actually the same player, so I don't want you to think that like this is catching on in some kind of popularity. It's really just one player that was like, yeah, that went well, let's run it back and see what happens, and it worked out. So like down here, it's a triple control lineup, which I expect we'll see quite a bit of as we get into this. And here we have like double control plus Jaxorn, which I think is more likely to be something like the Standard. So when we take a look at what's doing well, we have our mid-range decks. We have Jaxorn, Formidable, and Shen Jarvan. And this doesn't really fly as a lineup. The reason being, when you take all 3 of these decks in a vacuum, if you were to like play a mirror match, then Jaxorn is actually getting dumpstered by Formidable and Shen Jarvan right now. But if you take it into, say, a control lineup, then suddenly Jaxorn is really the only one that's holding its own. Formidable gets absolutely destroyed, especially one thing that you'll start to notice that a lot of these decks have in common is, I promised myself I would remember the spell's name, and I'm just not. Eradication. This card is being played in a number of decks. Warmother's certainly the most popular, and this really makes it difficult to play Formidable in this environment and feel confident about that. That said, I'm not sure how many triple Shadow Isle lineups you're going to be running into. It's like things are very polarizing right now is probably the best way to put it, where like if you try to run this lineup, then you're opening yourself up to a lot of shared weaknesses. If you take out the Formidable, then yeah, you've got a little bit like the Eradication deck suddenly become irrelevant. Like Eradication's not bad against Shen Jarvan, but you're really playing it as a blowout for the Formidable. So like it really just kind of depends on where people end up landing on Saturday, as it always does, as it always will. And I'll try to talk you through it as I can. When we look at control lineups, I think you can actually mostly ignore Nasus. Nasus always tends to look a lot better on paper going into the event than it actually puts up numbers. We've only got one Senna Nasus, and that's kind of par for the course for Nasus, is like it comes out, it does well in one event early on in the week, and then just kind of falls off from there. So if we're thinking about what control looks like, I think you're looking more at War Mother's, Heimer Nora, and Karma Set, and we can see a couple of those like splashed in here. War Mothers hasn't been performing in tournaments, but we'll get into what the stats say about it. Flavors of aggro. Elusives, Anti-Jin, and Ephemerals. Ephemerals being Gwen Zed. Is it an aggro deck? Who gives a shit? And then we have the wild cards, things that I've noticed or I just kind of want you to keep in mind that I think had a little bit of play, so I figured I'd chart them on the stats. We have Noxus Bandle Gunners, again, the one Enraged Fire Spitter deck. Jin Broadmane, because it did pick up a couple of wins in the Wolf Oxy events. I just kind of wanted to shout it out. But again, there's not a lot of stats on these two. In fact, I couldn't chart Jin Broadmane or Nyla Jana because there just weren't enough stats on them for the most part. And Zombie Ash is something that had popped up at the World's Qualifier that I just wanted to shout out. You know, got second place in EMEA, and like some people were kind of on it, so I figured I'd chart it just as a, you know, give you an idea of where something like that falls in, if it's something that you're interested in, because it did have such a good finish. But again, the Boulevard archives are on Twitter. They're actually my pinned tweet on Boulevard TCG, so if you want to go through and just like look at the top four, kind of remind yourself what was doing well before this balance patch, that again, like, didn't do a lot to some of the more middle decks, but let's actually get into what the stats are saying right now. So I kind of charted things out here the best that I could. Let's crank this down to 125 so it all fits on the screen and you can kind of see it. So I've kind of segmented things here for you just to try and make it a little bit easier to read. You know, we've got it segmented by like mid-range, control, quote-unquote aggro, and then like just some of the random decks that I wanted to chart to give you an idea. And one thing that you're going to notice right off the bat is, again, Jax Ornn not doing well into the other mid-range decks, but is the only one that is doing anything into the control lineups. And again, Senna Nasus you can kind of ignore. I think you're going to see more Karma Set and Heimer Nora. And again, that's built over in Zon Karma Set, not Shadow Isle Karma Set. But again, that is up to how people want to play it. Something important to note as well is Elusives. It feels like everybody always forgets about Elusives, and I always like kind of mention Elusives, and then they pop up like very low presence in APAC, but then we get to the Americas and suddenly, ooh, Elusives are everywhere. And I've made a little bit of an error here that like couldn't really fix, but something I want to call out here in the video. So this chart is based on Bandle City Elusives, Teemo, Yuumi, Bandle City, Piltover, and Zon. And it doesn't look very good. But one of the big things obviously being that like Control is dumpstering Elusives, the Teemo version. That said, there's always been two kinds of Elusives, and the ones that I believe actually did better are the Freljord Elusives, Fizz, Yuumi, Freljord. This, I would imagine, does a lot better into Control. Obviously, you've got Fizz, that's always going to be a great anti-control card. You've got Bone Club, that makes your units a lot more hardier. You don't have to worry about sort of like, because if you're just playing go wide Elusives, you're going to run into the same problems that Formidable does, where like an Eradication comes down and you get wiped. So while the stats don't look great for Elusives here, I do encourage you to try Fizz Yuumi rather than the Teemo Yuumi that I have charted, and just have that in the back of your mind is like, hey, you know, if I think things are leaning Control, then this is something that I definitely want to look at. And I will say, I do think things are leaning towards Control. The reason being, it's just so hard to run this triple mid-range lineup when just throwing one of these in here, or even just like splashing Shen Jarvan or Formidable, opens you up to this terrible set of matchups against War Mothers and Heimer Nora. It's a little surprising to me that War Mothers isn't doing particularly well in tournaments, or at least like hasn't won any of the 5 daily tournaments that we've had thus far, when its stats actually look pretty good, not just into the mid-range decks, but also into some of the other popular control options like Heimer Nora and Karma Set. Like across the board, War Mothers is actually doing absolutely insane things on the stats end. And again, Ephemerals is not something that I expect to see pop up in this tournament. You can see it's rather scattered on the matchups here. It almost seems more like a specific target for Jax Ornn. And it's a little bit of a weird factor right now, where Jax Ornn has been such a premier deck for the entire year, and then it just came in and like dominated the Eternal Open again. And so Jax Ornn is very much at the forefront of everyone's mind, probably more than it realistically deserves to be in Standard, at least, especially when we look at what was doing well before. Like Jax Ornn was kind of the bottom mid-range deck of the pile. Formidable and Shen Jarvan were definitely doing a bit better, and I don't want people to get baited into overvaluing Jax Ornn just because it did well in Eternal. The meta was rather different in Eternal, and here I do think it is your best splashable mid-range option. But again, I'm really not big on Shen Jarvan and Formidable right now, at least this version of Formidable. And because there are different versions of this running around, I have to pick one to put on the charts. What I used for this chart was Galio Jarvan. So I don't think Garen is going to significantly impact your things over Jarvan, but like some kind of split, you know, Udyr, Garen, we've seen all these different champions come through, so just something to keep in mind. And I think the rest of these are kind of self-explanatory. Now, Noxus Bandle Gunners is one of the decks that's doing well into Jaxorn. I don't know if Jaxorn's going to be popular enough to be a targetable deck, but if it is, then things that you're kind of looking for are like, you know, maybe that's where you want to go for middable, and you just try to ban the Heimer Nora that your opponent brings, because you're not really, like, again, War Mothers, I don't know if it's going to be very popular. Karma Set's kind of a wild card. It's never really, like, top of the charts. It's usually kind of, like, just outside the top 5, maybe at the bottom of the top 5. So the way that things are, I guess in a roundabout sort of way, is like Jaxorn loses to all the other mid-range decks. So you can't play Jaxorn in your mid-range lineup. But if you don't, then you can't beat Control. And so what a lot of people are going to end up doing is sort of mixing and matching a couple of mid-range and Control decks, and maybe even some of the wildcard decks. Like a lineup that I think I actually really like. If you just want to like kind of play it, I don't know how safe this is. Like, this is a rather untested theoretical lineup that, on paper, looks pretty good. You play Jaxorn, you play Freljord Elusive, you play War Mothers. This should give you a lot of game into the Control decks. It should give you a lot of game into the other mid-range decks, and it should be able to handle... Again, there's not, like... When these are what we're looking towards as aggro decks, it becomes very apparent that, like, aggro's not that real. So as far as, like, these are proactive enough decks. War Mother's a little sus, but again, it's doing very well on paper. It's very difficult for me to say because, again, I'm mostly dealing in the theoretical here, and there's not as many stats on it as I would like. And this is Trundle Volibear, because I think there's a little bit of a split. But, like, this looks pretty good on paper. And it's mostly in the theoretical, but, like, if you're taking anything away from this, like, I'd give this a shot tonight. Do it in one scrim for Boulevard, and see how you like it, and kind of go from there. Because this is going to be just a lot of mixing and matching. You're not really going to see a lot of triple control. You're not going to see a lot of triple mid-range, and so you need to find the decks that you're more comfortable on and gravitate towards them. But I would recommend, I would recommend against Shen Jarvan in Formidable, just because if somebody is bringing, like, if someone does run triple control, which you're going to see more often in Swiss than you are in Top Cut. In Top Cut, I think people are going to be gravitating a lot more towards the split. But in Swiss, things are always going to be a little bit more up in the air. So I think, like, hard committing to a triple anything is a little dicey, but I'd much rather see you on, like, triple control over triple mid-range because, yeah, Jaxorn's doing, like, pretty good into some of these control decks, but, you know, that yellow does mean a 46 to 49% win rate, so it's really only doing good against, like, Heimer Nora, because I don't think Sennasis is really going to pop up. So I don't want you to think that, like, yeah, Jaxorn steamrolls control. No, it's doing very well into Heimer Nora, doing pretty well into Nasus, which, again, I don't expect to see, and, like, holding its own against Karma Set, but, again, bad into War Mothers. So, if we're looking for what I expect the top 5 to be, it's really difficult to say because of all the mixing and matching. This is what... Oh, that didn't print out like I thought it would. Something that I just sent over to someone is, like, my prediction, and the problem with me is that these things kind of change on a very fluctuating basis. I'm pretty confident in those in, like, they'll at least be in the top 5. Formidable, the more I look at it, the more I'm like, I don't know, man. You're just so weak to the control tools that everybody's running right now. Not even just the board wipe, but, like, Quietus is something that people are going to be looking at really hard because it does very good into 2 of these decks, you know, popping the weapons, popping the weaker units, and even has some high-impact targets in Shen Jarvan, has some high-impact targets in Heimer Nora as well. So, like, 0-attack units are just kind of in a rough spot. And then kind of rounding this out with, like, Karma Set and Elusives, and I'm really not sure what the 5th deck is going to be. I don't think it can be Formidable. I think it, you know, like, I want to say it's going to be, like, War Mothers. Sorry. Not necessarily in this order, but, like, this is probably more of a realistic top 5 with, like, Jaxorn coming out of the ashes of this. Again, like, because we're looking at our top 5 as what comes out of Top Cut, what people bring into that environment, I think you're going to see a lot less Shen Jarvan, a lot less Formidable, a lot less Frostbite mid-range like we used to. But that's really all I can say about that. I feel like I've already repeated myself ad nauseum. So I kind of want to just let you guys go on this one, not really talk you in circles too much more than I have. But again, like, this is what's been performing well. This is what we're expecting. I'm expecting, like, pick a couple of these and maybe one of these, and you run the risks that you run. I think Elusives are something that people continuously forget about and underestimate, and hopefully with it coming in at number 2 at the previous event and then, like, not getting any nerfs since then, you just kind of use your brain and gravitate towards the one that isn't going to lose to all of the control piles, because even War Mothers is beating Teemo Yumi. You're just not tall enough and wide enough. Like one avalanche just wipes the board, and it's like, okay, that's basically game over. So yeah, Freljord, Elusives, Yuumi, Fizz is what I really want to be reminding people of and making sure that they're aware of. And again, like Noxus Bandle Gunners, I think, has some good enough stats to try and throw it into your lineup. Couldn't find stats on it versus Formidable, unfortunately, but like it's doing well into War Mothers, it's doing well into Noxus Bandle Gunners. That's a 50-50 on Karma Set, but the bad Heimer-Nora matchup is a little bit spooky, because if we're running into lineups like, say, this, Jax-Ornn, Nora, Heimer, Karma Set, then yeah, it looks pretty good, but is Jax-Ornn a deck that you want to be leaving up? You've really got to kind of consider your lineup when adding this one to it. That's always the thing with the wild cards. You just have to be much more mindful about the lineup that you are running. Now, if we're talking about what I would run this weekend, I don't have a goddamn idea. It would certainly be Jax-Ornn. Heimer-Nora is something that I've played a lot more of. And then Karma Set is a deck that I like. And again, I think Karma Set is like kind of interchangeable with Seraphine Set. The reason that people are doing Karma instead of Seraphine is because if this is your level 1, and even Ephemerals, if we're just looking at ladder, then you are dealing with very consistent decks. I just spit everywhere. You're dealing with very consistent decks, and that requires consistent answers out of you. And Seraphine decks, as a baseline, tend to play more redundant cards, but less copies of their good cards. For example, let's say Aftershock was really good. You're generally not running 3 Aftershock. You might run 2 and then like a Piltover Telstone, when really you could be running 6 copies of Aftershock through the Piltover Telstone. And so you don't want to just be hoping that your one of removal piece lines up with their threat. And also cards like Suttering Song Spinner that are borderline mandatory in Seraphine just feel really bad in these mid-range matchups, a little bit better in control. And so that's another variation of the lineup that you can do if you're expecting a lot of control. And for some reason you like Seraphine Set more than Karma Set, then by all means, that's something you can do. Because with Nyla being gone, I don't think you're seeing a lot of Temple. I don't think you're seeing a lot of prioritization of landmark removal out of the control decks or even the mid-range decks. So I hope that helped. Good luck, everybody, in the Last Chance Qualifier. As you saw in the announcement, I will be casting APAC with Spids. They actually basically asked me if I want to do APAC or the Americas, and I was like, you know what? Let's run APAC. Let's give APAC a shot. So that'll be pretty late at night for me Saturday into the early morning. But you know, I'm raring, I'm ready, and I'm hoping that we see some strong competition and some worthy players come through to round out our qualification. So thank you so much for watching. I have been Boulevard. You have been great, and good luck in your tournaments.